Hello all, Old Geek here, and in this video I'm going to start digging into MERP's combat mechanics. If you don't know what MERP was, or is, because even though it's not being published anymore, the books do still exist, then please check out my earlier videos on this game, especially the one on character creation, as that will show you where some of the numbers come from, and I'll be referring to some of those numbers in this video. I'll be making more than one video on combat in MERP, as there are a lot of details in the system, and I do try to keep my videos to short, digestible lengths. So let's dive in. MERP uses a percentile dice system for everything, and the results of actions within the game are resolved on charts, and there are a lot of charts. Many of the rolls are open-ended too. If you roll 96% or over, or 5% or under, you roll again and add or subtract the second roll to the first. So for example, I roll a natural 98, I roll again, and say I get 47. I now have 145. At this point, any applicable modifiers are applied, and I consult the relevant chart in order to find the result, which might then lead to rolling again and consulting a second chart. So you can already see here why some people found it all a little bit cumbersome. And yes, I am one of those people, because the organisation of the books wasn't great and there was a lot of page flipping going on between all of those charts. But I ran a few sessions of MERP quite recently over Roll20. And with the automation that exists on that platform, it all went rather smoothly. Anyway, I digress. A combat round in MERP is resolved in the following sequence. Firstly, declare actions. Everyone states their intended action, typically one of the following. Spellcasting goes first. That is either preparing or casting a spell. Missile weapons are next, which includes firing, reloading, throwing, all of that. Then you resolve moving manoeuvres, such as diving for cover behind a broken table, climbing a tree, or attempting to stay afloat if in water. Sky's the limit with those. They're followed by melee attacks, then it's movement, and finally you have static manoeuvres, such as picking a lock, using an item, or attempting to parley with the foe. Now all of these can interact in a variety of ways, which can add to complexity. It depends on what they're trying to achieve. So the purpose of this first video is that for me to simply focus on the action of making an attack roll. Missile attacks occur simultaneously during the relevant combat phase, but melee attacks happen in the order of each individual's base movement and manoeuvre bonus. Typically this means that lightly armoured combatants will go before those wearing heavier armour, but it does depend on the relevant stat, their expertise at moving in the armour, and their encumbrance level. At the start of the melee phase, everyone who is taking an action in this phase needs to declare their intended target, and then each is resolved in turn, in the order defined in the manner I just described. Every combatant has two key characteristics which define effectiveness in physical combat: offensive bonus and defensive bonus. If you check out my video on making a MERP PC, then you'll see that these come from a combination of physical stats, weapon skill, and items possessed. At its simplest, an attack in combat is calculated by rolling the percentile dice, adding the attacker's offensive bonus, subtracting the defender's defensive bonus, and then consulting the relevant table. And here is the table that the dwarf warrior I created, Geekly, would use, as he wields a hand axe, which is a one-handed slashing weapon. If he was fighting an orc wearing chain armour, then that is the column that would be used. With each result, a number is the amount of hit points of damage caused, and a letter is a critical hit. Mostly these ranged from A through to E, with E being the most severe. Geekly has an offensive bonus with his hand axe of plus 43. And let's assume the orc is using a shield, and thus its defensive bonus will be around 25, which is typical shield. I roll the dice and I get a decent number, 81. 81 plus 43 minus 25 is 99. Looking on the chain column of the table, that's a good solid hit for 9 points of damage. But the orc's armour has helped it here, because there's no critical involved. And if you look across at the other columns, if it had been unarmoured, for example, then the result would have been a 13C. 13 points of damage and a C critical, potentially quite nasty. You'll also see critical effects in both of the leather armour columns. Now pause a moment and look a little further up the table. In MERP, you are more likely to hit an armoured foe, but the armour typically reduces the amount of damage taken and the severity of any critical result. There are a few little oddities, and it does seem that the game designers really didn't rate soft leather armour much. So MERP has quite a few tables for various attack and critical hit types, but those that tend to be used most often are the ones relating to the game weapons. 4 main weapon attack types: one-handed edged, one-handed concussion, two-handed, and missile weapons. And these between them have 3 common types of critical: slashing, crushing, and piercing. So when I run the game, I photocopy sheets of these tables so that they are to hand, which reduces page flipping in the books. I try and make sure the players have access to a copy of their own personal relevant table and possible criticals, and that does help as well. There are variances across the attack tables, but in every instance, being unarmoured makes you harder to hit. But the consequences of taking a hit are more dangerous. And in the case of two-handed weapons against unarmoured defenders, it's likely to be catastrophic. Okay, so that's the basics, but there's more. Here's the table of attack modifiers, and at first glance they seem pretty sensible. But look at the line at the bottom, starting with variable. When declaring an attack, a combatant can choose whether or not they want to use some of their offensive bonus to parry, in which case the declared amount is moved from their offensive bonus to their defensive bonus. It's a really good idea because it can shift the balance of combat from offense to defense and vice versa. But if you combine this with the other situational modifiers listed, the number crunching does begin to ramp up somewhat. One odd part of the combat sequence and the calculation is the movement penalty. If you see, the table says -10 for each increment of 10 foot over 10 foot that the attacker has moved. And yet the attack calculation specifies a maximum movement of 10 foot when making a melee attack. And the movement phase occurs after melee. It's not explained, but I do wonder if this assumes that it's referring to the rare occasions when someone might pull off an extravagant moving manoeuvre during that phase, which gets them into melee range and thus presents them with a chance to attack. I'm not sure though. Maybe someone can enlighten me in the comments. Okay, having resolved a hit and the base damage, we now come to the gory stuff. The part of MERP that everyone remembers, not always fondly: the criticals. Now, I'm quite vocal about not liking critical hit effects and fumbles in D&D, but that's because it wasn't designed with those in mind. MERP was, and it's baked into the system. D&D combat is also highly abstract. MERP's is visceral. D&D combat is frequent, and if you fight that often in MERP, then your players are doing it wrong. I'll quickly deal with fumbles first. Each weapon has a fixed percentage fumble chance. Typically, big heavy weapons are more tricky to wield than light nimble ones, but they do potentially deal a lot more damage. It's risk and reward. There's a big juicy table of varied fumble results. These results are influenced further by weapon type. Most are quite minor, and you never hit your own allies. It is therefore a much better fumble system than I've seen anyone ever come up with for D&D. But back to criticals. Here's Geekly's list of potential outcomes, and look at the bottom how the letter classification affects the result. Ignore the T critical, as that's there for tiny creatures attacks, not PCs. Look at the range of effects and how they ramp up as you move down the column. So that plus 20 for an E critical has the potential to be big. The chart also shows the benefit of extra pieces of armour, with some of the effects negated by the defender having a helmet or arm or leg greaves. There's also copious lashings of black humour in here, because it's a game, and games are fun. Each damage type has a similar table, each with effects suited to that damage type. Crush criticals break bones, puncture criticals can pierce organs, and so on. Those instant death results are actually quite rare in play, but they do occur and serve to keep everyone on their toes, as even a lowly weasel can theoretically bite into a major artery and down a skilled warrior. Just not very often. So, MERP's combat resolution system. In basic terms, it has a lot of numbers. It's not fast at the table, and there's a lot of page flipping unless you copy out the tables for everybody. And if you approach the game in the manner of many other RPGs, it will all feel quite burdensome and punishing of everybody at the table and on the player characters. But MERP isn't meant to be played like that. Read the works of Tolkien. How often do the heroes evade combat? How many direct fights do the weaker characters get into? Not many. And when they do, it's usually a chastening experience. This combat system, in my opinion, discourages frequent direct conflict. It favours thought, tactics, avoidance measures. And it should be approached more slowly than combat in D&D, for example. And with that mindset in play, it's fine. In fact, it's very intelligent and rewarding. Yes, the numbers can still be a little bit headache-inducing, but here's the surprising revelation from my recent games of MERP. Roll20 really helps. In fact, the slow pace, immersive world details and lush maps of the MERP game are all perfectly suited to online play. I'll be running a game of MERP soon over Discord and Roll20 combined. If you are interested, then please join my Discord and make that intent known. Thanks for watching. See ya.